Alright folks, here I am with another single match video. This is one that, just a practice room game that I was playing earlier. You can see that I lost it, so spoilers there. But I think it was very instructive. You'll see that I really fucking blew it in at least one point and made some minor mistakes in some others. So we're going to walk through and take a look at how I fucked up and how to avoid that in the future. So, we'll start. I lose the roll. This hand, the cards aren't loading, that's fine. So this hand is okay. Hopefully you can see this. Oh, there we go. So it's got a business spell, it's got discard, it's got rituals. So basically I'm on the plan of turn 2, I can cast Limdul's Vault, and turn 3 cast Frenzy and hope that's good enough. Could theoretically win on the spot on turn 3, and I have a discard spell to protect myself. So this is a pretty acceptable hand, so I'll keep it. My opponent leads off with a Ponder. I lead off with a Thoughtseize on my turn. I think they shuffled off this Ponder actually, but that's fine. So I drew a Preordain, which is fine. Card to draw. I start with a Thoughtseize, and they force it, pitching Baleful Strix. So clearly, my concern with Underground Sea Ponder is that they're on Storm, and I could die if I just cantrip. But that tells me that they're pretty clearly on like Grixis or a 4-color control, but basically a base blue-black control deck. So I'm pretty happy to see that in general. I may choose to slow down, like rather than turn 2 Vault, I may turn 2 Preordain, especially since I didn't get hymned here. This makes me think they're holding up Drown in the lock, rather than playing out something. So I decided to just play a land and pass, and I'm going to Brainstorm on their end step, especially after this Thoughtseize. So Thoughtseize turns, or my Brainstorm turns up a Frenzy and a Vault. I decide that what I'm going to do is put back, I'm not sure if this was right, it ended up working out, but I put back the Vault and the Frenzy, and my reasoning is that next turn I'll draw the Vault, and then on their end step I can cast it. If it gets countered, then I'll draw the Frenzy and just be able to play that. And if they don't take my Preordain with this Thoughtseize, then I can, next turn, on my turn, I can Preordain into the Frenzy. I'll draw the Vault, Preordain into the Frenzy, and then be able to Vault for a discard spell to protect the Frenzy. So I do, like I said, they end up taking the Cabal Ritual, which isn't awful. I would have Threshold this turn if I wanted it, so it's reasonable. So I get to do what I just said, Preordain into the Experimental Frenzy, and then this Limdul's Vault can either act as counterbait or just find me a discard spell. I believe this Vault resolved. Nope, it got drowned. That's fine. So I played a land. I just jammed the Frenzy since I don't really have any better plan here. They're down to 3 cards. It resolves, and I just go ham on them. So I think that game, that's kind of like the ideal case, really, against these decks. So we beat 3 disruption spells, and kind of just went ham on them. And that's just how it plays out. You use your Limdul's Vault on their end step to find more, either as counterbait or find a discard spell, more interaction. Obviously they were completely out of interaction, but I could have beat like a Spell Pierce or something there. But yeah, that's how that works. So that's kind of an ideal case for Game 1. You should be fairly favored in these kinds of matchups in Game 1. Also worth noting that I said they might have been Grixis control. This setup looks like they only have bug colors, and you can't see, there's no evidence of red, so looking like just bug right now. So let's go to game 2. So keep in mind that first game in terms of like what to do. And then these ones might be a little more instructive about what not to do. So let's take a look at this hand, because I think this is my first mistake in this game. I'm not convinced this hand is a keep. I decided to keep this 7. I did deliberate about it for a while. 1 land is not a lot, and against these kinds of decks, even though they're not typically wastelanding you that much, especially with Ren and 6 now gone, they're less likely to try to cram in the wastelands, and they'll just have a more stable mana base instead. 1 land is just not that many, and this hand is not super resilient to discard, so if they start hitting me with discard, I'll probably be in trouble. So I'm not convinced this was a keeper, especially since the tendrils in the opener kind of makes it like a mull to 6. I should go over my deck list, actually. I'll do that at the end of the video, because this is a little bit different deck list than previously. But anyway, but I decided to keep this instead of mulliganing. So I believe they start with Ponder, and I can't remember what I draw here. So I drew a Ponder as well, which means I'm likely to start off with a Ponder, because I'm really looking for more land. I need to find more land. And this is actually a very good Ponder. It means that as early as next turn, I could cast the Frenzy with Thoughtseize protection. The way I probably should have piled this, so this is another mistake, and for whatever reason the undo feature, you can't see here, but the undo feature doesn't work with Ponders, so you can't, if you put a card back and you decide that wasn't the right card you wanted to put back, you can't undo it, which is really fucking frustrating. So what I should have done, Lotus Petal down first is the correct one, but I should have put the Thoughtseize and then the Mire, because if they Thoughtseize me, they can take the Frenzy or the Limdual's Vault, but I'll still be left with a business spell, and I'll still have my Thoughtseize for protection, and I'll still have my land in case they surgical me, because I'll draw the land. But what I ended up actually doing was putting the land down and then the Thoughtseize, so a little less than desirable. I play out my Lotus Petal just to get the mana on the board, and then I'll just click play here. So they do end up Thoughtseizing me, and they take my Thoughtseize, which means their hand is probably chock fucking full of counter magic. Especially considering that they don't have another land, there's almost certainly a reason they kept this hand, despite it seemingly only being a 1-lander, is that it likely is just full of counter magic. So that was kind of undesirable, but I still do have this Limdual's Vault available as a potential counter bait type of spell. So I think I just play the Mire and pass. I'm not going to play out the Bauble yet, because if I play out the Bauble and still want to Limdual's Vault on their end step, I'll have to crack the Lotus Petal to do it, and I'd rather save the Lotus Petal at this point. So I cracked this Fetch Land in their upkeep for some reason. I'm not really sure why I did that. I think I was thinking about Limdual's Vault in their upkeep. But I realized that my main concern with the Limdual's Vault my main concern about disruption with the Limdual's Vault was surgical, and it wouldn't matter when on their turn I did it, so I would rather try and get them to commit something to the board, and then tap out, so this would not get drowned in the locked or spell pierced or flustered or whatever. So it's not a big deal either way. I don't think it had a significant outcome or significant impact on the outcome of the match. But worth noting that cracking that in the upkeep is a little weird, but probably not. Probably doesn't matter at the end of the day. If anything, it might have even helped just confuse them. So anyway, I think they finally found their second land, which is the Bayou. And then here, I believe I cast the Limdual's Vault. So I'll just pause real quick. So that gets forced, which is like whatever. And they have Force of Will, or they still have mana up. This kind of looks like it might be like Ass Trophy mana or Drown in the Lock. So this is kind of the crux of this game right here, and I'm not sure if I made the right move here. So I drew a Doomsday, and I have a couple options. I can cast Experimental Frenzy. I could cast Doomsday, and I could cast either one of those plus the Conjurer's Bauble. What I decide to do, well, so they look like they're holding up Ass Trophy mana. Drown in the Loch obviously is going to stop either one of these plans. So, but because it looks like they're holding up Ass Trophy mana and they've already Thoughtseize and Force of Will, I'm inclined to not go for this Experimental Frenzy and instead make a pass the turn pile where I can draw a Thoughtseize to defend myself before I commit to the Frenzy. So here I'll just step through and we'll see what I actually did. I play I play the Bauble first. Playing the Bauble first is actually fine. It helps me potentially defend myself against a Surgical if they Surgical before Doomsday or something like that, or after Doomsday. But I decide Doomsday, and I make a weird pile that I'm not convinced was the right idea here. So, and we'll see why. So I have the Thoughtseize on top, which is desirable. That's what I want. And then the next one is a Dark Writ. The Dark Writ is because I'm going to, so the game plan here is basically Thoughtseize them, cantrip into the Dark Writ to be able to play Frenzy, and then we'll go, the next two cards are going to be LED, Doomsday. Cracking the LEDs to cast the Doomsday will put the Tendrils back in my graveyard, or into my graveyard, so that this Doomsday on the bottom of the pile can let me restack the pile and combo them out and kill with Tendrils. Now, the reason I think that maybe was a not so hot idea is because it opens me up to graveyard hate. It requires my Experimental Frenzy to stick around, and if they have, say, 2 Ass Trophies or a Force Will for the Thoughtseize plus an Ass Trophy, basically 2 pieces of disruption, gonna fuck my day up. Now, if instead, so let me just click through till it shows the 5 cards. So, if instead I had made a pile of Thoughtseize, Dark Writ, LED, Jace. Is that what I would have wanted to do? Basically, what I'm thinking is with a Jace in the pile, I could have a turn or 2 down the road, if my Frenzy plan got thwarted, I could crack the use the LED to make blue mana and bauble into the Jace and basically have another shot at winning the game, even if my pile got disrupted. Whereas with this setup, I'm opening myself up to graveyard hate, to Assassin's Trophy, to multiple pieces of hate from 2 different angles, i.e. Force Will plus Ass Trophy, and really not having any good reason to, except that it would be sweet to be able to like do the double Doomsday Tendrils loop trick. So I'll just click play here. It's probably, oh no, it looks like they got the order on the pile right this time. Sick. So I click play. They Ass Trophy my Lotus Petal, which is a problem because I needed all of that mana to be able to Thoughtseize plus Dark Writ into Frenzy. But it does mean that I can hold off and just Thoughtseize next turn and then Frenzy the turn after. And we'll now see another reason why this plan was bad, because when I Thoughtseize them, they Veil of Summer in response. So if I had, like, obviously Thoughtseize can beat, or Veil can, Veil stops the Thoughtseize no matter what, but if I had played the Jace, then if Jace had been in my pile, I could still win through a second Veil of Summer, because Jace doesn't need to target them, Jace can just target me. So Veil of Summer doesn't stop Jace. It's just basically just another reason why Jace is the optimal plan here. But they're kind of full up on shit. They have more cards in hand than me, and the plan just doesn't work. So you'll see this Frenzy get countered, Force Negation, and I conceded to this. If I had had a Jace in my pile instead of the Tendril, or instead of the Doomsday, next turn I would have drawn the LED, which is like not great. And then the turn after that, I would draw another LED and then be able to crack the bauble into Jace. So theoretically, I could have passed 2 more turns and potentially tried to win the game again. Obviously not a super high probability of that working, but the fact that it's a non-zero probability is better than the 0 probability that I put myself in here. Now, you might be able to say, oh, you could do the same thing here. You draw your 2 LEDs, LED or bauble into Doomsday, cast Doomsday, and then draw Dark Ritual, and then Frenzy, recast the Frenzy, and then do your pile, your Tendrils pile. The issue, of course, with that is I'm passing 2 more turns, so I then have to pass 4 turns instead of only 2. So basically, and it still loses to another Veil of Summer, which the Jace pile does not. So all in all, I think my pile there was really bad. It's possible that it was the correct play to just cast the Doomsday, like cast Doomsday and make a pile, as I did, but not that pile. It's also possible that it would have just been better to run out the Frenzy, and sure, it would get ass trophied, but like, I don't know. The kind of the salient point here, though, is that when your opponent has a shitload of disruption, sometimes you lose. Thoughtseize, Force, Ass Trophy, Veil of Summer, Force Negation. Like, that's a lot of disruption on a lot of different axes, and you can't always beat that. The fact that they actually exiled 2 Snapcaster mages to cast those free spells, like, we would have gotten grounded into the dust, grounded to fucking ash, if they'd had enough mana to start snapcastering things, so it would have gotten obliterated. So I think being aggressive and casting the Doomsday there is defensible at least, but that pile was indefensible. Now, on to game 3. So I'm on the play this time, and I can't remember what my opener is like. Okay, my opener is pretty good. I have a lot of defensive spells. I have a business spell. I have a cantrip. So on turn 1, I can cast the Preordain and cast the Petal to be able to hold up the Veil or the Flusterstorm. And on turn 2, I can cast Limdul's Vault while holding up Veil or Flusterstorm, and then potentially make a Frenzy or something to win the game on turn 3. So I am definitely going to keep this. You'll see that my opponent mulls all the way down to 4. So for my turn, I do exactly like I suggested. I play out my Petal and stuff. Preordain, I bought him both of those because I have plenty of defensive spells, so I don't really want that Thoughtseize at this point. It wouldn't have necessarily been a bad keep, but I just think that I have plenty of defensive spells and they're on 4. So really, like, I'm looking for something like the Ritual to make my Limdul's Vault into Frenzy a lot better. Looking for another mana, basically. And Ritual is the best possible draw there, and I more or less anyway. So, proceeding onward, they play a land, and I think just pass. Yeah, land pass. And so on my turn, I just play out my fetch land and pass. And here I'm intending to Limdul's Vault and use one of my protective spells to protect myself. Now, it's possible that I should have flustered that Brainstorm, but I think I'm so far ahead at this point that I want to hold on to this spell hold on to the fluster for defensive purposes. Anyway, so they hymn here. They cast the hymn, which I hadn't seen any hymns, but up to now, but obviously I expected them. I'm wary of there being some. And I draw kind of a garbage card, but it doesn't really matter because it's not stopping my game plan here. And then on the end step, I'm going to crack the Delta and the Lotus Petal to cast Limdul's Vault. Worth noting that here, my Limdul's Vault could get messed up by a Surgical on Flusterstorm, a Surgical, like, after Limdul's Vault, but So like there's an argument for waiting an extra turn to be able to hold the Flusterstorm up, but I just don't think it's worth it, because if they have all that stuff on a mull to 4, shit happens. But it's arguable that this was a small mistake to cast Loondual's Fault there rather than just wait a little while longer, since I'm not under any pressure. But this hand, or this set of 5, is pretty good. So I've got the Jace and the extra Frenzy, which don't really do a whole lot, but I can draw the Frenzy and then have an LED Doomsday on top to just go for the kill. So naturally, I'm going to keep this set of 5. Jace on the bottom, then the Frenzy, then Doomsday LED, and then the other Frenzy. So a Surgical here would be ruinous, but it didn't happen. So this is the crux of this game. Dark Rit into Frenzy. Which resolves. Cast LED. Crack it. Cast Doomsday. Now, they let the Doomsday resolve, so I'm trying to come up with a pile here. I have a Trop open. I'm trying to come up with a pile here that will defend myself against the maximum number of free spells that they could have. Basically free spells that they could have. So I need to be thinking about Surgical. I need to be thinking about Forces. I think it's very unlikely that something like Force of Vigor would be in play here, but I suppose it's not out of the question. So I believe the first spell that I click is this Veil of Summer from my graveyard. But then I decide that that's not the spell that I want, and I uncheck the Veil of Summer. Not yet, but at some point I decide to swap the Veil of Summer for Flusterstorm. And so we'll click through here and we'll take a look at the 5 cards that I end up picking. So the 5 cards that I end up picking are Jace, Fluster, 2 LEDs, and a Thoughtseize. So the idea here is Flusterstorm goes on the bottom, then Jace, and then Thoughtseize, LED, LED. The reason you do that is because you want to play out your LEDs first, so that they don't have anything worthwhile to Surgical, and if you get one LED onto the table, if they Surgical in response, and then the next card is your uncastable Jace, you have enough mana to cast it. Now, you might realize here that this Flusterstorm is actually pretty bad, because if they have a Surgical and they Surgical in response to my Thoughtseize, and then the Flusterstorm is on top, there's not going to be anything for me to Fluster. I suppose if the Surgical is still on the stack, I could Surgical my own, or Fluster my own Thoughtseize. But, so basically, this Thoughtseize, or this Flusterstorm, this Fluster, should be the Veil of Summer, because I can cast the Veil of Summer without a target, or without, like a spell on the stack to counter, and it still does the job of protecting me below Jace. Although, if they tried to counter the Jace, like if they had... Yeah, no, so basically, it's questionable whether this card should have even been here at all, and whether I should have just had Jace on the bottom, and then, like, Thoughtseize, LED, LED. And that maybe is the better play, and that's basically the pile that I did on turn 1. I mean, in game 1, jeez. So, the problem here, this pile theoretically will work. Anyway, it'll be one spell. The problem is that I piled it wrong, and it's doing the order wrong. So what I ended up doing was Flusterstorm on the bottom, then Jace, then LED, and then Thoughtseize, LED. So instead of both LEDs being on top of the Thoughtseize, what happened is I cast LED, cracked it to be able to cast the Thoughtseize, and then they Surgicaled my LED, and I didn't have the mana to cast the Jace. Whereas if I had both LEDs on top and just played them out before I cracked any of them, that wouldn't have been an issue. So I punted this game because I mispiled, and I was beaten by the Surgical. So yeah, that's really all there is to it. This is gonna make the order go in completely wrong. Obviously I didn't fuck up that badly, but those kinds of little things, like, realistically, if the frenzy resolved, they don't have a counterspell, a real counterspell. So surgical is kind of my only real consideration there, and I could have built a pile that easily beat surgical, but because I slightly messed up the order of the pile, I walked right into the surgical and created an unwinnable game for myself instead. So this kind of matchup typically is even to slightly favorable, in my opinion, for the Frenzy Doomsday deck. It depends a little bit on their sideboard. For example, if your opponent has something like Grafdigger's Cage in their sideboard, or something like a lot of blue elemental blasts, it can make your life harder because Frenzy is kind of the key card in this matchup. But in general, these should be slightly favorable matchups, and you can kind of see that in all 3 games, I was able to put myself in a position where winning the game was possible, but in games 2 and 3, I kind of blew it. And you know, I reduced my chances of winning the game by fucking up. But anyway, before I go, I'm going to do a quick look at my deck list that I've been playing with since the Ren and 6 banning. I've decided that, after some discussion in the Discord, maybe don't need 3 basics. So down to just the 2 basics, and I'm trying a green splash again. I've cut Empty the Warrens, and I'm just running Carpet of Flowers for my kind of like anti-Delver card. Also works against other blue decks, of course. You can get a lot of mana with the Carpet, and it's possible. I didn't side it in that matchup, but it's worth considering. So I'm still working out sideboard plans for this list because it's the sideboard's a lot different than with Frenzy. But this is a fairly standard looking green sideboard. Have the Tendrils back into the 75. I've been thinking about trying Tendrils in the main deck again and moving Jace to the sideboard, doing that little swap, but I don't know how I feel about that. Also thinking that if these kind of Hymn to Turok super heavy tap out control decks start coming back, it may become worth it to swap a Preordain for a 3rd Limdual's Vault, just so you're more business heavy. Or potentially even cut a Ritual for a Limdual's Vault. But I'm not quite at that point yet. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this was informative, and if it was not, you can blow it out your ass.